All right, hello, and thank you for joining us for this Forgotten Foundations of Fundraising webinar. I'm Austin Detweiler. I'm the managing editor of Philanthropy Daily, which is co-hosting this webinar with American Philanthropic's Center for Civil Society. If you don't know us, Philanthropy Daily is an online journal of news, opinion, and practical advice for those interested or working in civil society, philanthropy, and the nonprofit sector. You can check us out at philanthropydaily.com. You can join our newsletter to get weekly updates on our articles and invitations to events like this. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by two of my colleagues keen to share some thoughts about fundraising in late 2022 and through 2023. If you watch the news or if you have friends who watch the news, you probably know there's much said right now about what constitutes a recession. We've had definitions of this economic trend for some time, but we're not sure if those definitions apply today. There's also been a lot said about inflation, even record-breaking inflation, both domestically and internationally. So that means your dollar isn't going as far, and neither is your donor's dollar. But we're fundraisers, we're not economists. So the question for us is not whether or not we're in a recession, but the significance is the question itself, that we're all talking about recessions and inflation. Whether or not the White House or your favorite news station or your crotchety neighbor thinks we're in a recession, what we know to be the case is that everyone is concerned about our short and long-term economic outlook. And that, it turns out that may be more dangerous for fundraising than a real recession. A recession might not affect your biggest and most important donors, but uncertainty or worry, that affects your largest and your smallest donor alike. I think that means two things. First, at least while you're at work, stop worrying about the specifics of the recession or non-recession. It's an interesting question to be sure, but it's not relevant to fundraising work. Second, begin readying yourselves for some rocky roads, because whatever the economy holds in the future, we're all worried and that's going to affect our work. Socrates, you likely know, said that all of philosophy is preparation for dying. In a similar way, all of fundraising is preparation for tough times. Fundraising success, we say at AmPhil, is doing the right things the right way, consistently well over time. When times are good, your work is building relationships with donors that will withstand tough times, and then setting up systems, the habits and practices that reap rewards, and again, weather tough times. But we also like to say that the best time to start doing the right things is right now. If times are getting tougher and you're without a development plan or without well-defined donor caseloads, or maybe you have a fledgling digital presence or recently paused donor acquisition efforts, whatever the case may be, take heart. Even these times can be weathered wherever you find yourself. The fundamentals, importantly, the fundamentals won't change, but you'll want to be smart about how you operate in these times ahead. So with that, let me introduce two smart people who will help us think through that. I'm joined today by Kyle Vandermeulen and John Hanna. Kyle is a partner with American Philanthropic, where he leads a general consulting group based out of Oak Park, Illinois, a neighboring suburb to Chicago. In Kyle's work with American Philanthropic, he has helped countless organizations navigate good times and bad, with support on everything from strategic plans to direct mail, foundations, and major gift support. Outside of work, Kyle volunteers with the Frank Lloyd Wright Museum in Oak Park, which will be relevant again in a second. John Hanna is the Director of Education for the Center for Civil Society. The center's mission is to strengthen America's voluntary associations by improving the effectiveness of donors, foundations, and nonprofit organizations. And as Director of Education, John leads online and in-person events and conferences for fundraisers, donors, and others interested in philanthropy and civil society. Events just like this one. That's why we've got him today. Prior to joining AmPhil, John was program director at the Notre Dame Law School, where he taught and still teaches a course on philanthropy and the common good, one that I'm jealous I never had a chance to take. And he has held numerous positions in fundraising and philanthropy at Notre Dame and elsewhere. So Kyle and John also contributed important pieces to Philanthropy Daily's article series on fundraising when times are bad, which is where we got the inspiration for this webinar. Kyle brought his interest in art to bear upon fundraising with a piece to kick off our series, and John led us through one of the most important resources in a tough economy, foundations. So to get us started, it would be great, Kyle, John, if you would tell us a bit about what you wrote in your articles. Before I hand it over to you, I want to invite everybody who's with us. We have a big crowd today. Thank you for joining us for this important topic. Please send in your questions. You can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen or the chat tool, either one we'll see. We like these webinars to answer your questions more than mine. So let us know what's on your mind and we'll cover everything that we can. Now, Kyle, let me hand it over to you to tell us about your Philanthropy Daily piece.
Great. Thank you, Austin, for leading this discussion. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this conversation. I'm excited to hear your questions, excited to be speaking with all of you today. So in my Philanthropy Daily piece, I really wanted to look at kind of the big picture. I think absolutely what you mentioned, Austin, the fundamentals of fundraising should not change during difficult times like this. Now, I think, and believe me, as like an anxious person by nature, I look at like my retirement accounts, I look at the Wall Street Journal, I look at all this stuff, and I start freaking out, right? I mean, that's kind of human nature to do that type of a thing. And you almost immediately want to react, right? Like you want to make some big dramatic change to show that, you know, you're really taking this seriously. And that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. So in my piece and in what I want to talk about just at the beginning here before we get into kind of the discussion is just laying out a couple of these kind of key principles, these big picture points to keep in mind as we're thinking about this situation. And the first one is really a reassurance, right? The fact that Americans are and will continue to be a very generous people. So if you look at charitable giving, in the last really significant financial crisis we had, 2008, 2009, absolutely we saw a decline, but it was a measured decline, right? So I think charitable giving went down by about 7% in 2008, and then an additional 6.2% in 2009. So these are real declines, and a lot of nonprofits remember that time with difficulty because they had to make difficult decisions coming out of that. But I thought it was good to keep in mind that, you know, most of what makes up an American's net worth is their home value, right? Home values during that time declined by 30%. So we saw drastic declines in individual net worth, and yet people decreased their giving, but not by as substantial of an amount. And then we've basically seen year over year growth in charitable giving from that point on, right? So yes, we might see a dip. We likely will see a dip in charitable giving, but we're not going to see a dip across the board. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that capacity is just one component of charitable giving, right? If you're interested in architecture, for example, like me, my interest in architecture does not go away because I have to pay more at the gas pump, right? I'm still interested in architecture. So that's not going to change, right? So keep that in mind that yes, capacity is an important part of charitable giving, but it's not the only part. And it really actually isn't the most important part. The most important part, as I'll get to later, is the mission, right? And that alignment of mission. The second point that I want people to keep in mind is that relationships matter always. This is so fundamental for fundraising, right? So, but I want to emphasize this idea of relationships. Relationships are dynamic, right? So as the conditions on the ground change, as the environment and the economic environment that we're working with changes, our relationships might change as well, right? We might speak in a different way. We might emphasize different things when we're talking to our donors, but you don't stop the relationship. You don't kill the relationship because this is a difficult economic environment. One of the kind of maxims that we go to for this type of discussion is that, you know, when things are difficult, you want your donors to be near, dear, and clear. You want communications with your donors to be very clear, right? You want to be dear to your donors. You want to keep that relationship. You want to be near to them. You want to continue to communicate with them. You don't want to just stop all communications, which is a temptation for a lot of nonprofits going through a difficult time like this. The third point that I want to emphasize is that cultivation really is key. Even in great times, retention rates are only about 46% year over year. I think that's a tragedy for the nonprofit sector as a whole. And this is a phenomenal time to do something about that, right? So let's say that you're going to your project that your acquisition efforts are going to be a little bit more difficult, which I think is a somewhat likely thing to keep in mind, right? It may be a little bit more difficult to get a new donor during this time. So why not emphasize even more retention efforts, picking up the phone, calling your donors, adding that reminder mailing to your year-end giving, doing an additional email, a social media post, right? Just trying to really emphasize retaining the existing donors that you already have during this difficult environment, because these are the people that have already identified as people who are interested in the work that you are doing. So go back to them, talk to them, right? Really think about ways to retain your donors this year. Number 4, clarify the value of each gift. So this, I think, is actually a very important point, because most of us are not traditionally going around and always thinking about like the price of gas or the price of milk or the carton of eggs. But with this kind of environment, we all know those numbers, right? Like I filled up yesterday, it was $4.49 a gallon, right? I remember that. I would not have remembered that a year ago. So I think even more so, coaching your donors, showing your donors what the value of $100 gift will mean to your organization. So important to do. It's not this kind of vague, ambiguous gift, but $100 will feed a school child for a month, right? Really trying to make the offer clear in your communications with your donors is going to be very helpful. Finally, and really most importantly, it's all about the mission. And I'm sure we can all come up with good examples during COVID of organizations that were not health organizations or anything to do with kind of like a COVID. And yet all of their communications was about COVID and how difficult COVID was for the organization and how their budget was affected. That might be, I'm sure that is true, right? And I don't want to belittle any organization that lost income during COVID because of that. But the mission is really what draws your donors to your work, right? You can get away with maybe one time kind of playing the sympathy card and saying our organization was forced to do X, Y, and Z because COVID, shut us down or whatever. But that's it. Like, go back to the mission, right? It's time to go back to the mission. This is what interests people in the work that you're doing. This is what should be front and center in your communications, your relationships with your donors. So those, I'm really excited to get in these conversations. Those were just kind of the 5 key points that I really wanted to emphasize in my article and then in this discussion today.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm going to echo the last point just a little bit because people probably find it annoying, but I always like to draw the sort of like sales analogy and fundraising analogy around the mission, because people spend a lot more money on consuming than they give philanthropically, right? And why are they spending money? Not because they care about the bottom line of the company they're spending money at, but because they care about the product they're getting, right? When your favorite shirt company calls you and says, hey, we're really having trouble with our Q3 earnings, can you buy a couple shirts this month? You're never gonna buy, but they sell you a good shirt when times are tough. Same thing. Your donors aren't interested in your bottom line, they're interested in the mission, right? To the extent that they care about the bottom line, like Kyle says, you might be able to pull it off 1 or 2 times, things are tight, but they care about that briefly because they care about the mission. But they care about what you do. That's why they're doing this truly miraculous thing of giving you hard-earned money oftentimes and receiving nothing in return. So thanks for all of that, Kyle. John, let's dig into the weeds a little bit on a specific thing here. So foundations are really important all the time, but especially I think when times get a little tougher for everybody. Tell us about that a little bit.
Absolutely. Let me just say the whole series is great. The whole series on fundraising when times are bad. It's great writing, a lot of great pieces of advice in there. I'd encourage all of our viewers to go back and read all of those at Philanthropy Daily. As you said, my piece is on foundation fundraising during these uncertain times. And the things that I stress in the article, well, the first thing that I say to people is don't assume that foundations, or at least all foundations, are hurting. And I am like Kyle. I check my retirement account way too often. I check the S&P every day. I try to see what's going on. And I know in my mind, the S&P, for example, is down peak to trough, 15, 20%. And it's not a good feeling. It's not a good feeling when you're trying to save money for retirement, or you want the economy overall to do well. And of course, we all think like, wow, foundations, they live off of what? They live off of, most of the time, endowments, right? But don't assume that the foundations that are in your network, or the ones that you want to approach, that they are having, the worst of times. It's not impossible that foundations have money in investment opportunities that we don't know about. Some have money with private equity, with venture capital, with things that are well outside the S&P. So just because the S&P is down a certain percent, don't assume that a foundation's endowment or corpus is also down that percentage. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. And also, a lot of foundations, even those that live off of endowments, they could have more donors over the last 6-12 months, adding more money, infusing more money into their endowment. The point is, you just don't know. And so don't assume, oh, the foundation's hurting, they don't want to hear from me, or I'm not going to make the cut. That's a really bad assumption. And as I'll talk more about, foundations exist to give money away. They're legally, they're legal entities that we've approved as society and as taxpayers to say, you exist and you get certain tax benefits, at least the donors that supply the money, but you need to give that money away, and people by and large have the right to send letters of inquiry and ask to be partners. So as I said, don't assume the foundations are hurting, but to echo what Kyle said as well, relationships just matter. That's true with individuals, it's true with corporations, and it's true with foundations. And so I actually think this is a great time to engage foundations that maybe your nonprofit hasn't talked to in a couple of years, maybe a foundation that's been on your radar. It's a great time to engage foundations and have conversations. For one reason, some fundraisers might not be bothering because they might be making the assumption it's not a good time to talk to the foundation, but this could be your window to have a conversation where that program officer 2 years ago, when their phone rang, every day, asking for conversations, now you might be one of few still asking to talk, who knows? So I would say to build those relationships, to start new relationships, it costs you almost nothing to send an email and ask for a meeting. It costs you almost nothing to leave a voicemail and ask for a meeting. I wouldn't suggest that people send 10, 20-page proposals out of the blue without a conversation, without a letter of inquiry that was well received. But again, I think it's a good time to have a conversation because, as you said, Austin, I'm not an economist. I'm a fundraiser, and now I'm a consultant. And so I won't be so bold as to say when the economy is going to turn around and when the S&P is going to go back to near 5,000. But what I do know is that eventually it will. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And how great would it be if when that finally happens, if you as a fundraiser, you have a great new connection to some program officer or some person at a foundation that can invest in what you're trying to do. So again, keep picking up the phone, keep sending letters of inquiry. It really doesn't hurt. And you'd be doing a disservice to your organization to not use this time to plan accordingly. And like I always tell people when they're looking to increase their foundation giving, it's really important to map out the connections that your organization has, not just you personally, but your organization to the foundations that you want to engage. So if you have a chief development officer or a CEO or people on your board, it's really important now to do some sort of sleuthing, to do some research and figure out, okay, we know we want to approach, X foundation. Now's a good time to do the research again and say, well, does our president, do they know someone at this board? Do they know someone in leadership? Especially now, because with the economy in flux, a lot of board seats are changing. People are moving on to the next chapters of their professional and personal lives. Some boards are expanding for different reasons. Now is a really good time to do that research and figure out who do we know at the foundation that we want to partner with the most. So keep those things in mind. And again, as I said a second ago, these foundations exist to give money away. And so again, it doesn't matter to the foundation that the economy is bad or that gasoline is a higher price. They exist to give money away. As we know, and most of the people on the call probably know, yes, foundations exist, or they're required to give 5% of their corpus away each year. And while it's true that that 5% may be less in the next year or two because of the down economy, again, we cannot assume that. And there's no rule that says a foundation can't give away more than 5%. Some foundations, they're in spend down, they're sunsetting. You just don't know what the pot of money they have to give away the next couple of years is. So you got to have the conversations.
Excellent. Thanks, John. Yeah, that's the main point I always think of. I just did the math really quick. So there's 330 million Americans, and there's a little over 100,000 charitable foundations. So that's a small percentage, 0.03%, but a lot of giving entities that have to give money away. You want to be a part of that pie. It takes time, it takes commitment, but you got to lean into it. The other really important point you made there, John, I don't know when the economy is going to turn around, but it will. I think that's the main thing. So let's lean into that a little bit. We've got to think long term here, right? So the economy isn't bad for X number of fiscal quarters now. It might be bad for X number of fiscal quarters more or years. We don't know. It's going to turn around, and you want to be in a position of strength when it turns around. So we've talked about big picture. We've talked about foundations. So if money's tightening, right, we're coming into the biggest fundraising season of the year, Q4, especially December. And a lot of organizations, I think, are behind, okay? And say Q4 is not as strong as ever because of the way the economy is. Going into next year, what are some strategies you might recommend to foundation heads to manage a slightly tighter budget looking ahead? It can often feel like what I do is programs, and there's the superfluous fundraising thing over here. Is that a good idea to cut fundraising or to start there? Kyle, do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. No, I don't think it's a good idea to necessarily just do an across the board cut, right? I think it was in Chris Kittemeyer's article where he used the phrase, you want to use a scalpel, not an axe, for something like this. So yes, I mean, almost always there are going to be opportunities to take a second look at the budget and to find opportunities to trim in certain areas. This is not the time to do a whole stop cut of like an entire program or an entire part of your fundraising, right? This is really the time to evaluate what is going well in your fundraising and to double down on it, right? So if your acquisition and you have a really good acquisition package that has proven itself in multiple rounds of tests, don't let up on that, right? Double down on it, mail more. If the acquisition is going well, do that, do more of it. If, let's say, your return on investment of your large gala, even in good times, has not been great, this might be the time to reevaluate that, right? Is there a way to shift from a large gala to something like a more intimate kind of wine and cheese event, right? Where it's a simpler event, but you still have a good donor experience with the people that you're trying to connect with during the event. So that's the type of thinking that I would be doing going into 2023 is, and this is important. This was in our colleague Doug Schneider's piece of really knowing your budget, right? So one, where are you getting your money from? What is the breakdown of foundations, individuals, major individuals versus kind of your general donors? What is your reactivation of lapsed donors? Like really thinking critically about where you're getting your money, what is working and what you can double down on, and then maybe what isn't working and maybe pulling back on that. The same with like your programs and activities and internal expenses. Maybe you have a big offsite plan for 2023. Can you do it over Zoom, or can you do, instead of one large gathering, like 3 smaller gatherings of people who are connecting together? So this would be the type of thinking that I would be bringing to the budgeting process for 2023.
Let me add one point about acquisition too, right? So The thing about acquisition is you're losing money on it right now and investing in growth later. So if things are tight now and you pull back on acquisition, you're actually hurting yourself in several years when, as John points out, when things might be turning around and those organizations who stayed invested in acquisition, they're going to take off when the economy takes off, and you're going to be left behind because you won't have donors to replenish that pool. So you really got to make sure you're filling in that acquisition pool a little bit. Let me back up sort of big picture here about what's really going on here. So John, let me throw this one to you. What about the current economic environment makes fundraising more challenging? So say you've got a gift officer sitting down with a donor, or like you were saying with the foundation head, what might that donor say? Hey, here's why I'm tight, or here's why I'm cutting back on my giving. What should they expect to hear?
Yeah, I think the obvious answer is that people should expect, and that a lot of our people on the call probably are hearing already in person, is look, inflation, right? You know, when it costs you 8, 9, 10% more to buy groceries, that's a big thing for American families, even, you know, wealthier families that give a lot more. So they're going to hear about inflation. They might hear about gasoline. I think housing prices are a big one too. Now, if someone isn't moving, and they're, you know, it might not matter so much, but if a family, you know, is thinking about moving, or, you know, that's on the horizon, all of a sudden, you know, that home that they wanted to buy to either move to a different city or a different state, now they're thinking, oh, wow, this is going to cost me, you know, 20, 25% more. In some markets, much more than that, right? And so, you know, as we all know, you know, housing is, for most Americans, their biggest expense. And so I could imagine people hearing that. But the one thing that I'll say that we're not talking about enough is that unemployment is still very low. So I was pretty much fresh out of, you know, my graduate degree when I entered the workforce in 2008. And I just distinctly remember that crisis. Like, that crisis was very severe. It hurt a lot of people, and a lot of people were laid off. And we can all think back to just a few years ago with COVID. When COVID first happened, a lot of people were laid off. You know, significant amount of people had no jobs, massive unemployment. That's how I think this crisis is somewhat different, and that unemployment is incredibly low. People that have jobs, or people that want jobs, for the most part have jobs. And so because people are working, I think we need to worry a little bit less about, you know, can they afford to still do that recurring gift? Maybe they're doing a recurring gift every month or every quarter. Can they still make that annual pledge? If people still have income, that's at least a good sign that we can try to sustain or maintain the donor base that we have. And again, some people might not be as generous as they would have, but it's still a good sign that people have the income and the revenue, and that they can make that contribution. So again, we're hearing about inflation, we're hearing about the housing market, but we need to look at the positive here. Again, the positive: people still have income, people are working, and a lot of people have jobs much better, you know, than they thought they were going to have a couple of years ago. A lot of people have jobs they love a lot more. Either they work remotely, or they got to work for the company they always wanted to. So for some people, times are better than we might recognize, or that we might think.
I like that. That's a good point. It's helpful to keep in mind the positive vision about what's going on. And as long as unemployment stays low, that reinforces the point we're going to come out of this.
Right.
Let's not be so positive though for a minute. Oh, go ahead, Kyle, please.
Sorry, I want to just add one point to that, because I think it's important. And I mean, we'll see on the other side, like, what actually happens. But I suspect that a lot of, and I think that the average number of charitable organizations that an individual donated to is something like, on the average, like 7 a year or something. So I suspect that what's going to happen is that will go from 7 to, depending on the individual, maybe like 3, 4, 5, right? So I don't think that people are just going to stop giving. I can say that that's not going to happen, right? But what I think is that, you know, you might have like walked by a fundraiser that was going on one day, and like, you know, you had a little extra money, so you donated to that. I think people are going to be more focused on the organizations that they're donating to. And that's why, again, like, the relationships really matter, right? Because you want to be one of those top 3, 4 charities that your donor is donating to. And you get that way by communicating with them, by building a relationship, right? Like that is what I think is going to happen. It's not going to be an across the board, end of contributions. They're just going to be a little bit more tailored or targeted to the groups, that are responding and reaching out to them.
Okay, good. So let's drive this point home with echoing something you said earlier. Relationships matter. Give us one really important thing to do in Q4 to keep relationships strong.
Right. I think phone calls, right? Just pick up the phone and talk to your donors. I think that makes such a huge difference. And I know a lot of people will respond right away and say, but we only get voicemails, right? Yes, but even having a voicemail from a nonprofit that says, hey, thanks so much for contributing. I'm thinking about you. And an invitation with their phone number to call back if they wanted to. 9 times out of 10, that donor is not going to call back, but 10 times out of 10, they're going to listen to the message and they're going to appreciate the fact that the organization reached out. So double down on gratitude, pick up the phone, call your donors, really make this a time for thanking them for their gifts.
I would
also,
add too, can I just add that
please.
Now is the time to think about how you tell your story. I still think that most fundraising comes down to storytelling. And I agree with Kyle that I could see a lot of donors who are giving to, 6 or 7 nonprofits. All of a sudden this year, it's going to be 3 or 4, at most 5. But they're not going to be cutting their philanthropy across the board. They're going to be thinking really hard, talking to their spouse, their family, their friends, thinking about what do I want to do? Which of my gifts really matter? And so you want to be that nonprofit that tells a great story. And again, it depends what your nonprofit does. I can't speak broadly, but you want sort of that in Q4, end of year giving, you want that emotion. You want that sort of, this is why your gift is important and why it really makes a difference. And if you can tell that story better than, out of those 7, if you can tell a better story than most of them, you're still going to get your gift. If you can't tell your story really well, then you might be sort of the one that's cut. So really work on that craft with your colleagues and make sure that you have it down really, really well.
Yeah, that's great. Somebody asked in the chat box earlier, how often should you revisit the mission statement? I don't think the question meant how often should it be edited? Rarely. I think it meant how often should you say it? And I think, John, your point is often. You should often be saying the mission and to the emotional appeal, right? The problem that the mission is solving, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So I want to go back to Kyle's recommendation to make phone calls. One objection you might hear is it's Q4, everybody's busy. We've got a lot to do. We've got donors to renew. We've got big gifts to close. So Kyle, who at an organization is allowed to make phone calls to donors?
Yeah, anyone at an organization. In fact, it's oftentimes better if it comes from like a programs person or someone who directly interacts with the work of the organization, precisely because they have those stories that John was just talking about. They're in the field. They've seen the beneficiaries of your work. They can say, I was just talking to a person yesterday, and this is the way we're able to help their situation, right? So I know a lot of people get nervous about it, but again, like this is not cold calling to like ask for money. You're talking with donors who have already identified as people who are interested in your organization. They've made a gift. The emphasis is on gratitude, right? You're just calling to say thank you. You just want to give them a story of what their gift meant to your organization. So anyone can pick up the phone. And I love bringing in people from outside the fundraising department because it shows them also that their job and whatever programs they're working on are dependent upon the people who are giving that money, right? So it's a wonderful way to build relationships outside of just the development department and with the entire organization.
I think that's great. I assume most people here today are fundraisers, but just a story in your back pocket, if you're listening and going back to your colleagues. I work with a group and just the other day, the Salesforce administrator said, hey, I'd be happy to take some time to make donor calls through the end of the year because he's excited about the mission. He knows it matters and his voice on the phone will mean something to those donors. So feel free to take that to your CRM administrators and let them know that they should be on the phone too.
That's great.
I promised we'd stop being so optimistic a minute ago, and I want to lean into that. So yes, John, you pointed out like a lot of donors still have money, but also some don't, and that's why, as we say, some are going to be putting back from 7 charities down to 3 or 4. But donors are usually giving money to help people who are in worse positions than them. That's why they make donations. So if donors, whether they're large or small, are suffering, that means there's going to be other people suffering who maybe need the nonprofit support now more than ever. Now, that might sound a little out of tune to a donor who's feeling a pinch himself. Kyle, can you give us some thoughts on how you think fundraisers can deliver that message without sounding out of tune?
Yeah, well, certainly if you are in the kind of social services, human services sector, and you are directly helping people who are affected by the negative economy, I mean, those are the stories you want to be talking about, right? The price of food is just ridiculous, the inflation in food costs in particular. So if you're an organization that's running a food bank or a food shelf, this is what you emphasize in talking to your donors. There's a significant need among these people. I thought in one of the pieces, this was Eric Streif's piece on how to kind of change direct mail for these types. Traditionally, you might base your ask array off of like the donor's highest past contribution, and then you go up from there. So he mentioned like maybe making a softer ask array or kind of a softer ask even, like we recognize that these are difficult times. We certainly don't want to put you in a difficult situation, and yet our mission continues to be important and relevant for these ways. We care about you. We want to continue this relationship, this partnership. If you have the ability to give this season, wonderful. If not, we still want you to know how grateful we are for your past giving. So you kind of want to nuance the way that you talk about it. And maybe it's a softer ask than previous times, a stronger emphasis on the gratitude. Again, you don't want to pull away from opportunities for them to give. Let them make that decision, right? At the end of the day, no one is going to be offended by the fact that you're asking for a charitable donation because you're a charity. This is how you work as an organization, right? So no one's going to really be bothered by that. The way that so you want to give them those opportunities, and you just want to be thoughtful and kind of nuanced in the way that you're doing it.
I'll add 2 small points to that. So again, if we're talking about human services, nonprofits, especially, if there's a way that you can quantify what that gift can do, if you're asking that $500 donor to renew this year, when because of the economy, he or she maybe cannot do it, if you can quantify and say, look, that $500 is going to feed X amount of people, like, wow, it's hard as a donor to say, I don't want to do that again this year. I've been doing it for 3 or 4 years. Yeah, I'm hurting, but I really want to stretch and I want to still feed these people, right? So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that, again, if you're human services and it makes sense, I mean, look, I worked in higher ed fundraising for over a decade. My goal was always to get donors on campus. When donors are on campus and they see the students that they are helping, they're much more inclined to give. So if you work for the kind of nonprofit where you can say, hey, instead of meeting for lunch this time across town, why don't you swing by the office and we'll get lunch at a place right next to it. It'll be great. And then if that person can walk through your office and see the clients that you serve, or that community in particular, if it's serving people, that's really, really effective. And it just goes back to storytelling, right? So if you can engage people in real, unique ways, it's just human nature. It's a lot harder to say no to those kinds of experiences.
That's great. Here's another good one. So when we're thinking about which donors to focus on for making these kinds of messages and making sure we keep the revenue coming in, are there any donors, John, let me leave with you on this one. Are there any donors that you think are really important to lean into in economic environments like this?
One group that I think of, and there are probably more, but the one I've been thinking a lot about lately is if you have donors that have donor advised funds. If a donor or a family has a DAF, I would be thinking, wow, they could have been adding to this donor advised fund, the last we had, before this crisis, we've had the bull run of bull runs where the S&P, went up, whatever, 100% over, a few years. And so I might be thinking, wow, like, yeah, we're down peak to trough now a little bit, but they might have a lot of money in that donor advised fund. And with current threats as far as legislation to change donor advised funds, they might be looking to give those funds to a nonprofit that, again, has the right message and tells the right story. So that's what I've been thinking about a lot lately. I would pay extra attention on those.
That's
I
a
would
great
just
point.
add
I mean,
too,
that's
like,
money that's already given. Go ahead,
Right.
Kyle.
Right. Your most loyal donors, like the long-standing donors, the donors that have been giving, year after year for 5+ years. These are the people that are really your closest partners. This is a great opportunity to, continue cement that relationship, because they've been giving with the organization through kind of thick and thin, right? These are the ones that are really your allies in your mission. So it's a great opportunity, great time to go back to them.
Yeah, in one of the articles, I think it was by Chris Kiddemeyer at Philanthropy Daily, he told a story of a donor who lost her fortune in the recession and nobody visited her. As he says, not to make her feel awkward, which I understand. But when she made her money back, when the economy turned around, she was not interested in seeing those who weren't around. So there's something in sticking with those donors who've been with you through thick and thin. Stay with them and their thick and thin, and wait for it to come around again. I have a few more questions here. One came in through the Q&A here. Do you feel like social media posts are replacing direct emails? So how would you value the importance between social media and mass emails in this time? Let me also contextualize that with mail. So let's think big direct response, mail, emails, and social media. How would you weigh all these options right now?
I can jump in. So replacing, no, complementing, yes.
Yep.
So what we've really learned is that people are becoming multi-channel well, I shouldn't even say becoming, people are multi-channel users of any material that we consume these days, right? So we see organizations in our inbox through emails, we see them on social media, we also see them in the mail. If it's a local community organization, we might also kind of see them in the community in person, right? And all of that works together for the greater good of the organization. So I would not think about pulling back or pulling out of any of those channels. What I would do is really look at, are we putting the consistent message in front of all of these channels, right? Is what we are saying in email consistent with what the donor is seeing and reading about us in direct mail, in social media? Goes back exactly to John's point about thinking about your story, telling your story. Are you telling the same story? And when you tell the same story in these multiple places, one, you're just giving people multiple opportunities to give, right? So they can sit down if they want and write the check out to the organization when they get the direct mail piece, or they can click a link on social media, or in email, they can click another link or give right away, or whatever these opportunities are. Text to give, this is another thing that a lot of organizations are doing right now. So I would say, absolutely, you should not be kind of like cutting off opportunities for people to give. You should be complementing them through these various media channels, and just making sure that you're consistent in everything you're putting out to your donors and your followers.
Mm-hmm. And like you said earlier, Kyle, when we're trimming on costs, cut with a scalpel, not an axe, right? And mail is more expensive than email. So you might pull back on a mailing and increase the emails. You can send as many emails as you want. With Giving Tuesday on the horizon, I'll mention, while it's over celebrated, it is the one day where everybody expects to be bombarded by emails. So don't be left out. They're free to send. As long as you're still invested in the email platform. So we're talking about, that's a good segue here. Say you cut back on mail a little bit, you lean more into email. Well, email tends to have a lower average gift than mail. Or say we follow Eric Streif's advice that Kyle mentioned a few minutes ago, and you use a lower ask string when you do send mail. we might see average gifts going down, and that might see total revenue go down when that all pans out at the end of the year. Do you guys have thoughts on messaging to board members, preparing them for how ROI is going to change right now so that you're not going into the lion's den in board meetings?
That's a great question. Wow, that's really good. I think it depends on your board. It depends on your history with those board members. But I mean, I definitely feel for fundraisers in this environment right now. Yeah, I mean, I would think, what I would suggest people do is be entirely honest and don't just say, oh, it's going to be great in Q1 or in Q2, it's going to turn around. Because as we said to start this webinar, we just don't know when. And so I think that a lot of people, fundraising is a world where it's always like, what have you done for me lately? Right? That's sort of the world that fundraisers live in. And I worry that fundraisers might overpromise that 2024 is going to be great, and by Q1 or Q2 at the latest, it's going to be turned around. I would just be incredibly honest about the situation and really manage the expectations. But Kyle, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where like development planning really is so important, right? Because you should be coming into this environment, this situation with a plan in place. And then when you're reporting to your board, you can talk about changing or adjusting the plan, but you already have that kind of common language, that basis for conversation that already shows what you've been doing and projecting. And then you can talk about how you've pivoted during this economic environment, but you're not just showing up to the board meeting with nothing, right? So that you're bringing kind of like, this was our plan. This is what we're going to need to do to adjust given the situation and the circumstances. And then this is where you emphasize things like retention rate, right? Because if you can keep your donors, even if they decline on the average gift during this difficult environment, it's going to you'll see the dividends, next year when the economy or whenever the economy kind of takes off again, because those people who kept with you during this difficult time might be much more inclined to increase their average gift once they've kind of gotten through this difficult kind of economic environment.
It could be an opportunity to really stress to board members who in the past have not been completely helpful as far as leveraging their own network. And now might be the time to say, hey, we've been asking you for a few years now, like, can you make this introduction? Can you do this? Can you ask this person if they can come to this event? Now is the time to really go and ask for that, because again, if the bottom line isn't what the board wants it to be, now is the time to say, look, you're the board. In some respects, you are the chief fundraisers at the end of the day, right? For some nonprofits, not for all, but for some nonprofits, the board members need to deliver. And if the numbers aren't there, they need to do what they can and they need to pull their weight.
Good. I don't know the answer to this, but I think it's an important question. When things are getting tough, are in-person events still worth doing, or is that a place to pull back?
So Joe Garect wrote an article for the series on this type of a question. And this is where I'd look at the past, right? So, well, I guess, okay, yes, obviously, this is still an opportunity for people to get together. And if that has been successful for your organization, absolutely continue to do that. Now, maybe instead of doing your event at the Ritz-Carlton and having like the prime rib, you go at the Hampton Inn and you do the chicken dinner or something, right? Because that's not actually what excites people about those types of events. What excites them is the opportunity to connect with people from the organization, to hear stories from the people who are on the front lines of the programs, or meet the leadership of the organization. So figure out what is the selling point of those events and protect that. Everything else can be up for discussion, but if it's really that people just love the CEO's report, or they love a testimonial from a beneficiary, keep that. And then again, everything else you can talk about, you can change, but really think about what is critical to the success of the event and try to replicate that.
That's good. I mean, we mentioned earlier, when you're thinking about acquisition, lean into your highest ROI acquisition activities. We can expand that to everything you're doing when you're cutting with a scalpel and not an axe. And I think Joe says this in his piece that we just linked in the chat there. What's the ROI on your fundraising events? If they're good, then keep the ROI. If they're not good, then cut them. And ROI could go a lot of ways, right? There's different ways of thinking about it. But if it's thin and you're cutting back, that's a place to start cutting back, or at least tightening down on it. Let's while we're talking about cutting, are there any silver linings in a recession like this, or what might be a recession, we should say? Can we see any opportunities if we're thinking long term, or if we really try to be hopeful about what's in the future? John, any thoughts?
One that I can think of, I've been thinking about, is if you have a donor who over the past few years was thinking about an endowed gift and they just never pulled the trigger. Now could be the time to have that conversation, because a smart and intelligent donor is going to know, wow, if I can park my money, in the endowed fund right now, I could have a really great first couple of years, or that endowment could really, really grow. So that's a silver lining that I see. And again, it might not be applicable to everybody, but again, if you have a donor that was flirting with an endowed gift, I would start that conversation. And if they can't make the endowed gift to the level that they said before because of their portfolio, I would say, well, can you start the endowed gift? Can you start the fund? Can you put some money in it right now and explain to them, as I'm sure they'll know, that now could be you're buying on sale, right? You could be buying on sale with the endowment, and that would get them really excited. That then they're going to know, wow, I'm an endowed benefactor with this nonprofit that I love so much. And again, it might not be that high gift that they had in mind a few years ago, but now they're a stakeholder, right? And then when times are better, and however long it is, they're going to consider that endowed fund the first place that they go to give more of their money. I'm sure.
I like that notion of buying on sale a lot, actually. And when you're thinking about endowments, that sort of thinking bigger about more complex gifts. There's a recent article, again at Philanthropy Daily, about planned giving and really tax advantageous ways that you can help your donors really benefit while also helping you. If things are tight and somebody's older, or they're offloading property because of things tightening up, that can be, you can actually provide some really creative ways to benefit them in times like this, or frankly, in any time. That's good. Kyle, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll give an example that came up from visiting my nephew last week. He's a freshman in college, and I was asking him about kind of the difference between high school and college. And he was saying, high school, he didn't have to do a lot of work to get an A in a class, right? It kind of came naturally to him. He didn't have to study all that much, and he got the A. But in college, it's much more rigorous. So he's realized that his study habits have had to change, and he's really had to kind of step up his game to get that A in college. And I think this analogy works with nonprofits as well. So if you were doing all right, going into this recession, but you didn't really have a strategic development plan, you didn't really think about donor acquisition kind of ROIs and strategies, and you didn't really have to report much to the board, this is a great opportunity to take that time and think about a strategic development plan. And okay, what are we actually going to do when we need to align our budget with our revenue, right? These are real questions that you have to face now. And so, there is a little bit of a silver lining in stepping up the internal infrastructure of the organization and your own kind of capabilities of managing a development department. So that's kind of what I would love to see organizations doing and thinking through during this time.
Yeah, that's a great point. This might force us to develop better habits. During when we were sort of coming out of COVID, or a year or two ago, I looked at two nonprofits, an article in Philanthropy Daily, one that had a development plan and one that didn't, and how they weathered those tough times. And the plan helped. This might encourage some of us who realize we're a little bit behind the eight ball when things get worse, that it's time to start planning to get in front of the eight ball. That's really helpful. Tough times might toughen us, might make us better in the long run. Thank you, Kyle. Those are everything. We're approaching the end. Any closing comments or last reflections from you, Kyle or John?
I'll just say, you mentioned it, Austin. We're going into Q4. We're going into the holidays. We're going into the traditional kind of charitable giving season, Giving Tuesday, December, year end, all that kind of stuff. Don't hold back, right? Adjust, pivot. This is a relationship, right? That's what I was saying at the beginning. Like, relationships are dynamic. You might change the way you talk with your donors. You might change the way you talk with your prospects, but you don't change the fact that you are talking to them, right? So don't hold back. Really be thoughtful. And if you haven't put together your year-end plan yet, hang up the Zoom call, clear your schedule, and put together that plan, because now is the time to do it.
I would echo what Kyle said. I love the point earlier in the webinar about enlisting anyone at your organization. Like, that was such a great point. If you're a CRM person, if they want to hop on the phone and make a few calls, that's really good. And so, fundraisers know these next 2 months are just so crucial. So it's your job, work hard, tell those stories, and you're going to be okay if you put in the work.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's what I heard popping out from you guys. John reminds us, tell the story well, lean into why your donors should be supporting you and let them know. Kyle told us focus on retention. I think that's really important. Get people on the phone, be excessive with gratitude, make sure your donors stick around and renew their gifts, and do not pull back, especially the next couple of months, but even going into the next year. Work harder, lean in, and remind yourself that the mission matters. We always like to say during these webinars, we put these out for free because we think that civil society matters, and we know that all of you working hard for nonprofits are the backbone of civil society, are propping this all up. We're grateful for it, and hope that we have something to offer you to sort of pull back and think about what you're doing and maybe help the work. It matters what you're doing. That's why we're here. Thank you for what you do, and good luck leaning in. Let me tell you a few more ways real quickly that you might learn about what's strengthening your job and everything. We just linked in the chat our events page. You can see everything that we've got coming up. There's 2 big things. We have a masterclass on planned giving. This is really important right now, as we just talked about. These are 3-hour limited group courses to really sort of lean in, roll up the sleeves, and do some hard work to understand more about planned giving, whatever the topic is. That's November 3rd. You can find it at the link in the chat. And we're starting a fundraising fellowship for junior fundraisers to sort of partner with American Philanthropic consultants and research civil society, fundraising, and strengthen their careers. The application deadline for that is January 20th. That means that you can get started now while also focusing on all of your higher priority end of year tasks. But don't forget, do get that in. Feel free to be in touch with any questions. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Kyle, John, thank you very much for being here today.